In the summer of 2007, I went on a trip to southern France with my grandmother for a program called Elder Hostel. It was my first time in Europe since I was 8, and I was very excited. We boarded a plane at Logan on an early August morning and landed in Paris about 8 hours later. From there, it was only about 3 hours on a connecting flight to Bordeaux, where we met up with a group of 9 other grandparent-grandchild pairs and our 2 guides. At this point, no one knew anybody yet, so in general, the kids stayed with their respective family members. We took a bus from the airport and soon arrived in a small historic town, only a couple of hours from Bordeaux. Our hotel was a 2-story building spread out across a large green lot on a quiet street. The town itself was on a hill and built with various bridges and overpasses, providing a very medieval and classic European feel. We would be spending the next week in this town, and in order to familiarize ourselves with the surroundings, our first activity was a scavenger hunt. Of course, the first problem presented itself when we were told to make groups of 3 or 4. Not having met anyone yet, we were all rather hesitant to approach one another. But eventually I ended up with a girl named Emily from Maine and 2 boys, Damien from Oregon and Ian, a fellow Bostonian. Together, the 4 of us became our own little group and did virtually everything together. The second problem that we faced that day was coming to terms with the fact that we didn't speak French and most of the townspeople did not speak English. In an attempt to get ahead of the other groups, we decided to go and ask for help at the visitor center, but that possibility was quickly crushed when after only a few moments we realized we had no idea what they were saying, and vice versa. The language barrier continued to be a problem throughout our stay, but luckily it was greatly diminished when we met Jean Bernard. Jean Bernard was one of our program guides, but as he put it, his main job was to keep us kids entertained, and he most definitely did. He took us on various excursions to activities like miniature golf, or pool, or simply played games with us back at the hotel. The fact that he was fluent in both French and English came as a lifesaver whenever we were off by ourselves without a French-speaking grandparent nearby, and it wasn't very long until we became his favorite kids, who went with him everywhere. Besides daily trips to explore the town, we also received both French and cooking lessons, and went on day trips to many different sites. We visited castles and even explored mansions. We went into a vineyard and learned all about the process of making wine, while exclaiming over the amazing estates and gardens nearby. One of my favorite trips was to the dunes on the coast. The dunes were huge mountains of sand stretching as far as the eye could see, surrounded by trees on one side and the ocean on the other. They were part of a national park, but the entrance had been turned into tourist central with various stands and shops ready to prepare and remind travelers of their long hike up these hills. A series of ropes were strung up the incline, but nonetheless, most of the grandparents decided to opt out, considering how hard it is to walk in sand. We kids, on the other hand, were very excited and leapt at the chance to climb such an amazing formation. We reached the top slightly gasping and found ourselves looking out over the ocean. Further down, we could see multiple people flying about with brightly colored hang gliders and parachutes. Hot from the climb, it was then that my group and Jean Bernard got the fabulous idea of hiking down the other side of the dunes to the beach below, where we could either swim or simply wade in the water. Of course, it was then that we realized our biggest problem, because although it hadn't been very hard to run down a mountain of sand, going up was a very different story. Within minutes, we were huffing and puffing and even crawling as we forced ourselves up the impossible slope. The farther we got, the slower we became, and by the end, it had taken about 20 minutes to climb up and only 5 to go down. We visited the dunes during our last few days in the town, before traveling back to Bordeaux and then back to Paris to catch our respective flights. The trip was my first taste of freedom, and it confirmed my love of travel and desire to visit Europe as much as possible. On this trip alone, I can probably say I learned more about making friends from places I'd never been to, overcoming language barriers, and being independent than I have on any other. It was an immersion in both a new culture and a way to learn more about my own. Overall, my time in France was one of the greatest things I've ever done, and probably my most educational. I made lasting friends, and I even got my Paris t-shirt. There may have been a few exhausting and frustrating times, but in the end, I wouldn't have traded this experience for anything in the world.